Hello everybody, here to do a lecture on the Sicilian Najdorf, and today we're going to look at the 6 bishop e3 variation, which historically was never that popular, but these days is all the rage. And there's two moves that we're going to look at here, e5 and e6, and they're both pretty popular these days, e5 being more so. So the first one we're going to look at though actually is e6. So the point of e6 is now very simple, you take some of the central squares, you'll play for b5 at some point. And now white has a big crossroad to ponder here. He can play hyper aggressively with g4. He can play bishop e2, trying to play sort of a passive shenanigan structure. Or he can play f3 with the plan of g4, queen d2, and castle queenside. So the first one I'm going to look at is bishop e2, which I think is not too amazing for white. So what I suggest here for black is queen c7. The natural move b5 fails to bishop f3. I lost a game in such a manner to Grandmaster Kachian. And after e5, knight f5, black of course can't take this because here white is just dominating on the white squares, and bishop g5 will come, getting rid of this knight, and this bishop is garbage. So here black's best play is d5, just trying to remove the defense of this knight. Bishop g5, and now d takes e4 is not going to be very inspiring on something like this. And bishop takes f5, knight takes f6, and there's a billion discoveries with this knight. This rook is under attack, and if black takes this, bishop takes f6, and absolutely everything is falling. So instead, black should play d4 here. But now knight d5, and if knight b d7, white can just castle. And there's really no way for black to develop his pieces. For example, bishop c5, white might just kick it with b4, and there's just nothing to be done with this bishop. And the only other idea is h6 followed by g5, but in this case, knight takes d4 is going to come into play. For example, bishop g3, knight takes d5, e takes d5, queen f6, knight takes, pawn takes, and now queen e1 check is a nice move. And if black blocks this check with something like bishop e7, then d6 with a pin on this piece and a discovered attack on the rook. And queen e7 is no better, because again, d6, and after queen takes queen, rook takes queen check, this rook on a8 is going to fall. And if g6 for black here, just trying to kick this knight away, just knight takes d4, and queen takes d4 should be devastating. I don't think that black really should have any defense to something like this, like bishop g7, e5, for example. There's just nothing. As white's whole position is falling apart with bishop hitting a8, pin on this diagonal, this knight falling. This is just horrible. So in this position, queen a5 check is considered the best move. But here, there's a very strong idea with b4. So on bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, queen takes b4 check, white has this nifty move c3. White wants to attack the queen, because then knight takes g7 will come into play. But if he does bishop d2, then queen f8, and black seems to be holding on. So c3, and now after queen takes c3 check, bishop d2, the game's just over. So I'm not a fan of b5 right away, but queen c7 is an excellent preparatory move. So now, for example, if white castles, I think b5 is an excellent move. And it's awkward for white to deal with this because he wants to play f4 and bishop f3, but he can't here because after f4, b4 is very strong, and this pawn is going to fall. So after b5, white should probably play something like a3. It's also possible for white to play a4 here. But in general, I don't think this position should be that much for white. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is this hyper-aggressive 7g4. And there's a lot of theory behind e5, knight f5, g6, g5, g takes f5, e takes f5, d5. It's really theoretical, and I'm not such a fan of all these incredibly forcing lines where whoever leaves their computer on longer is going to be winning the game. So what I like is in this position to play h5, striking at the base of white's pawn chain. And it's kind of awkward for white to find a good defending move. Obviously h3 fails because the rook hangs. So usually g5 is played, and now knight takes e4. So if knight takes e4, bishop takes f5, black's just a healthy pawn up. So instead, white plays knight takes g7 check, bishop takes g7, knight takes e4, and now d5. And this knight probably has to go to g3, because if knight c3, d4 is going to fork the knight and the bishop. So after knight g3, knight g3 also attacks this pawn, which is kind of nice. Black should play d4, bishop d2, and now queen d5 is a nice move. The point is, now this rook is attacked, so knight takes h5 is impossible in view of rook takes h5, followed by queen takes h1. So here white will usually play rook g1, which is very sensible, trying to gang up on this pawn again and maybe prepare bishop g2 and controlling of the c4 square. But here black can play bishop g4, and that was really the point of queen d5, was if black played bishop g4 right away, then just f3 is totally fine for white. But after queen d5, rook g1, bishop g4, bishop e2, for example, I guess knight c6. Black seems to be doing okay. I don't think he has any serious problems. Some great players like Gelfand and Chaparinov have played this line for black. So now let's get to the main stuff, which has been really popular off and on for the last few decades, is f3 here. So f3, black plays b5. And now there's a big parting of the ways again. Queen d2 right away, or g4. While these both are part of the plan that white wants to play, it's actually very important what move order he plays them in. And personally, I believe queen d2 is the better move. Because after g4, black basically has to play h6 to keep this knight from being booted into oblivion. And now queen d2, black will play b4. And this knight has no real good square. As we'll see later, in a lot of these kinds of positions, white will want to play knight ce2. But here black plays e5, and then this knight here has no real good square, b3, f5. f5 is going to get kicked by g6 at some point, so b3. And now black plays d5. And I think black's pretty happy here, because he's got a large chunk of the center. However, after queen d2, this doesn't quite work. If black plays b4 here, this pawn is attacked. There's no weakness on g4. I think white's doing just fine. So black should play a normal developing move. And I think knight bd7 is that move. Oftentimes people will naturally just want to play bishop b7 here, but I don't think it's very accurate, because in a lot of cases, white will play knight b3 to a5 with hassling. So I usually like to play bishop b7 after knight bd7, so that rook c8 and bishop a8 is possible in such situations. In this case, for example, bishop b7, g4, h6, I think knight b3 is very strong. Knight bd7, and maybe just castle here. So knight bd7 first, and then g4, h6. So white has a few moves here. Oh yeah, I should mention before anything else, if black plays knight b6 here, this is what black often wants to do. For example, if white castles here, then black is very happy with something like this, where he can play this knight to d7 after white plays g5. But I think after knight b6, a4 is actually kind of an awkward position for black after something like knight c4, bishop takes, and castles. because while this b2 pawn is on an open b file, it's kind of hard to see what black's going to do about it, and I think that white can expect to have good attacking chances with moves like g5 and h4, h5, and even knight c6 coming in at some point, and other ways of attacking. So h6 here, and now we see basically if we had played g4 first, we're getting the same position, but we're forcing black to play knight bd7 here, which is not as good a move as e5 or is b4 and e5 in that case. So here white castles. And now again, there's a big parting of the roads. This is a very topical line. Historically, a lot of players have played bishop b7 here. And after h4, just trying to push this pawn through, b4, knight a4, queen a5, b3, knight c5, and then this knight move for white, a3. So the point is on knight takes a4, white plays a takes b4. Queen c7, b takes a4. And there's a lot of theory behind this line. The key point that holds white together is that d5 will always be met by e5, and black can never take this pawn because bishop f4 traps the queen. So there's a lot of theory there. It's supposed to be slightly better for white. I'll believe it. I personally rather do other things. So instead of bishop b7, I played b4 right away. Now, one thing that's tricky about this move is, although it's very strong, it's not as commonly played, although you still see it a lot. People will often confuse this line and play knight a4, like they would in the bishop b7 line. But in this case, knight a4 is just bad in view of knight e5. Now, this point of knight e5 is very deep. This knight here won't be able to move because it's tied to the defense of this pawn on f3. And with this bishop on c8 rather than b7, bishop d7 comes into play immediately, putting pressure on this knight, which has no squares. So when I first show this to people, I usually see them say, oh, queen takes b4. I just take a pawn, I free up the square for my knight, and white's happy. But after bishop d7, it's actually very awkward for white to find a move here. For example, knight b3, what are we going to do about this queen? It's got virtually no squares. It's got b3 and a3. Both of them are vulnerable to potential attacks. So here I actually suggest queen c7. It's possible to trap the queen right away, I think, with d5, queen b3, rook b8. Wait, hang on. d5, and then, yeah, queen b3, rook b8. But for some reason, I think maybe knight db5 here is pretty strong after something like this. White's going to have a great attack. And so I think the best move is actually queen c7. So there's going to be much less pressure on the d file, and now the queen really is threatened. So the move that, there's a few moves white can play. White can play a move like knight b1, but then after d5, black can just take this pawn back, and he's going to have a nice central mass. For example, queen c3, queen takes, knight takes, d takes e4, and I think black's doing just fine in this endgame after something like knight takes e4, knight takes c4, d takes e4, knight takes g4. Should be about equal, but I actually prefer black's position. And the only other sort of tricky way to try to save the queen is queen b3. Now d5 is bad because if e takes d5, rook b8, d takes e6, rook takes b3, e takes d7 check, and I think white has an excellent attack. He's going to have a rook, a piece, and two pawns for the queen, and I think that white's in great shape here. So rook b8 fit immediately, d5, just cutting off a3, fails. So rook b8 first, queen a3, and now if d5, queen takes a6, and white survives. But instead, I like this move knight c4, forking the queen and the bishop. So bishop takes c4 is forced, and now queen takes c4. And now, as you can see, a6 is now protected by the queen. And it's very hard for this queen to find squares, too, on a3. It has a5 right now, but for example, if queen a5, d5, I think black's going to be doing very well. His attack will come first. If e takes d5, bishop b4 just traps the queen. And it's hard to see what else white's going to do. For example, something like knight e2, d5. And the queen's attacked, this pawn's attacked, so something like queen a5, again, bishop b4. So queen c3, and now queen takes a2 seems strong. It just looks like black's going to have a good position. So, and if knight b1, trying to be a little more defensive, d5, queen d3, this isn't as good now because knight b3 and white's going to have some attack down the d file and knight c3 coming in. So, but here I think that queen takes d3 and followed by e5 is totally fine. And something like this after rook c8 check, you know, this is forced, and then d4. Black's going to get a piece back with, you know, a pretty double-edged position after something like knight takes d4, but totally playable and definitely chances for a win. And also, black, if he chooses, can take a2, but I'm just not as big a fan of this move. So, with that being the case, I personally believe queen takes b4 is not the best move. I think b3 is white's best try. So after b3, the point is on bishop d7, just give this knight some breathing room. And I should also point out, if something like queen takes b4, bishop d7, b3, rook b8 is very strong because queen a3 is met by d5, and something like queen c3 takes, and queen d7, and this pawn's going to go, and the white king is very weak. So b3, bishop d7, and now knight b2. So the best move here now for black is d5. It's a very common idea to play b4 and d5, striking in the center. So it's actually hard for white to find a good move. E takes d5, knight takes d5, black's knight is ready to invade into c3, maybe take off this bishop instead. And his center is very compact. It's very hard for white to threaten anything. So white should play bishop f4 here, attacking this knight. So now there's two moves. For someone like me who likes to attack but not go completely berserk, I like to play queen c7, protecting this knight, again, renewing the threat of d takes e4. White's best move is now knight d3, knight takes d3 check, bishop takes e5, bishop g3, bishop c5, knight f5, takes. White should probably take with the g pawn to open up the g file. Takes, and castles, and it's a very double-edged position. Black will definitely have his attacking chances with moves like rook d8, bishop d4, and of course it's not winning or anything, but it's interesting, and I think black has good chances, and I like this kind of position. I should also point out that I messed up recently in a game in this line where after I played d takes e4 first here, which is, I mean, if white plays f takes e4, bishop c5, knight f5, we're going to transpose. But white doesn't have to play f takes e4, because f takes e4, maybe he's scared of this. I don't know why. We're too greedy, I think. But I'm sorry, my computer is being a little strange. F takes e4, I think, or d takes e4, I think rook h e1 is a very strong move. And obviously e takes d3 is met by bishop takes e5 with some deadly discoveries. And I think black's under a lot of pressure here. For example, in the game, I played bishop e7, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes e4, f6, f4. And here I just castled. I have to give white a pawn. But, all right, I'm sorry, my opponent didn't play f4. But if he did play f4, I would just castle and I'd have to give white a pawn. That being said, I don't think this position is necessarily so bad for me. After something like bishop takes e5, queen b7. I should also point out that rook takes e5 runs into queen takes e5 very nicely, and bishop g5. But something like bishop takes e5, queen b7, attacking this rook, menacing bishop g5, bishop takes g4 is always in the air. I think black's got great compensation, but suddenly it's not so nice. But I do realize that not everybody shares my sedate view of chess. I used to think very differently when I was younger. So knight takes f3 is another move that a lot of people have been playing. So people might look at it and say, wait, knight takes f3, I just lose my knight. But then knight takes e4. Black's got a powerful center. He's got knight c3 coming in. This queen's hit, and it's hard for white to find a good move. For example, queen e1 looks very natural. Just trying to hold f2, looking everywhere, but then just queen f6, and I think black's just winning, hitting these pieces. And it's hard for white queen to find a good square. This is the only square that is even remotely good. Every other move just loses instantly. And here black puts a funny move, f6. Keeping pieces out of e5, closing off this diagonal so that bishop c5 can come into play. And there have been a lot of games in this line. Black's doing okay, I think, after something like knight d3. Queen a5 is pretty strong, putting pressure here. And if something like king b2, knight c3 is always devastating. And so white probably just has to give up this pawn on a2, but I think it's a very interesting line. Oh, there's other moves that can be played here for white. I saw queen takes b4, bishop d7, knight b3 have been played by some great players, including actually Vladimir Kramnik, but he lost to Topalov in about 20 moves, and the only time they played this variation. I think Topalov played a5, forcing the queen to be jailed on a3 to protect this knight. Black shouldn't really play d5 here because of moves like knight c5 or bishop c5, but here Topalov just took on f3 and just started taking a lot of center pawns, and white's pieces are still really tangled up. And again, Topalov won that game very quickly. So for this reason, I think knight a4 is not the best move in this position. I think knight ce2 is. And I should point out that after bishop b7, h4, b4, now knight ce2 is not as good as knight a4 because here I think d5 comes with much more effect. So, for example, if white takes this, black's obviously quite happy with his position. And if after d5, white's other try is bishop h3, just trying to quickly play g5, g6, and hit this pawn. D takes e4, g5. This is actually key. H takes g5, h takes g5, e takes f3. So if g takes f6, d takes e2, black's got this bishop takes h1 coming, this is hanging, and his king is actually relatively safe, and I don't think white's going to be checkmating him anytime soon. He can expect to lose. So here white will play knight f4, most certainly trying to attack this pawn. And if black plays, and black should play knight e4 here, and now this queen has a hard time moving, but the key is something like queen d3 or queen e1. Black's best move is actually just rook takes h3, and then playing something like this. And it's hard to see how white's going to really continue his attack. Black can play knight takes g5 soon. He's going to be able to castle queen's side. White's just a little bit slow. So that's why knight a4 is important in this position, because after d5, bishop h3 takes g5, e takes f3 won't come with tempo, and black's just going to get killed by g6. So that's one thing I should point out. So after b4 immediately, knight ce2. If black plays bishop b7, among other things, white might be able to just take this pawn now because the bishop on b7 is hanging, so d5 won't be such a big player. So if black plays d5 here, which is the move he wants to play, this would be great if the position were, if white played if we had by transposition these moves thrown in, this would be great, but unfortunately, it's not as good now because after e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f4, black's under a lot of pressure. Again, if black could play bishop b7 and white was forced to play h4 here, black would be doing just fine. But as it is, after bishop b7, bishop c4, this knight's awkward. It's just hard to find a good move. And if knight takes e3, for example, queen takes e3, this pawn's just going to go. And then the whole king is going to fall apart. So I think d5 right away is a mistake. So what I think should be played is queen c7. And now, again, if white plays queen takes b4, d5 is totally fine. If queen c3, for example, takes, queen takes c3, knight takes c3, and d takes c4, should be fine for black after something like d takes after if like something like d takes e4, for example, bishop b7, bishop d3, knight c5, g4 is falling, e4 is falling, white's not keeping his extra pawn. So knight takes e4, knight takes, and knight f6. Well, again, white's not keeping his extra pawn. The sending should be okay for black. And if white plays h4, this runs into d5. So the key point here is after e takes d5, knight takes c5, knight f4, bishop b7, for example, bishop c4 can no longer be played because this queen on c7 controls that key square. So, and if white tries to just go completely crazy, I'm not sure this is really going to work after something like e takes f3, knight takes f3, h takes g5, h takes g5, knight e4. And now it's actually hard for white to find a move for this queen. For example, queen d3, knight c5, black's getting tempo, and maybe black will play something like g6 to try to shore up his weaknesses, or maybe just play bishop b7 and castle queenside immediately. Actually, bishop b7 is probably stronger. The key, though, is queen d4, which is the natural move, runs into actually bishop c5 very nicely. Queen takes e4, bishop b7, and white will not be able to keep his extra piece, and I think approximate equality is reached. So I think that this is a great way for black to play this line. It's going to be very sharp, and if you're a very positional player, you don't like getting attacked, you probably shouldn't play this, but it's solid enough, and it's theoretically sound for the most, as far as I know. I'm not 2700 yet, but I think that black can really expect to be able to play these positions aggressively and for a win. So that's going to wrap up this lecture. I will see you next time with a lecture on e5 in this position.